On March 14, 1852, 7 women disappeared from a plantation located outside Montgomery, Alabama, under circumstances that federal investigators would later characterize as unsettling beyond typical understanding. The individual responsible, Elijah Thornhill, had lived as a recluse for 15 years prior to acquiring exactly 7 enslaved women at auction, marrying one of them 3 months later and witnessing the others vanish one by one over the subsequent year. Local documentation indicates that authorities received 43 anonymous letters outlining the disappearances. However, no investigation was initiated until a federal inspector arrived unexpectedly in September 1853. What he uncovered in Thornhill's ledgers would expose a pattern so systematic, so meticulously calculated that it implied years of preparation. The reality behind those disappearances remained locked in federal archives for 78 years. Before we proceed with the narrative of Elijah Thornhill and the women who entered his estate but never exited, I request that you take a moment to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell, as stories like this one, hidden in neglected documents and sealed testimonies, are what we aim to illuminate here. Additionally, please inform me in the comments regarding the state from which you are currently listening. I am eager to learn how far these dark histories extend. What the inspector discovered that September afternoon would challenge everything the community of Montgomery believed they understood about the unassuming man who had resided among them for over a decade. The estate was situated 3 miles west of Montgomery's main thoroughfare, accessible solely via a narrow dirt road that meandered through thick groves of oak and pine. The locals referred to it as Thornhill Estate, although Elijah Thornhill himself never adopted that name. For him, it was merely the property, a 240-acre tract he acquired in 1837 with funds inherited from a textile business in Charleston. The main house was a modest 2-story building, painted white but dulled by 15 years of neglect, featuring 6 windows on the upper floor and 4 below. All of them were shuttered even during daylight. Elijah Thornhill was 47 years old in 1852. He was a tall man with stooped shoulders and gray strands interspersed in his dark hair, which he wore longer than was fashionable. His face was weathered, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, and he had the distant gaze of someone who had ceased to engage with the present moment many years prior. He donned the same dark coat throughout the seasons, its fabric worn thin at the elbows, and boots that had been resoled so many times that the leather had lost all form. Those who remembered him from before 1837 described an entirely different man. Joshua Peaton, who ran the general store on Commerce Street, recalled Elijah as sociable and quick to laugh, a man who participated in every social event and generously contributed to the Methodist Church. He had a wife, Margaret, and 2 daughters, Peaton recounted to the federal inspector years later. Adorable little girls, perhaps 8 and 10 years old. The family resided in a fine house on Court Street, right in the heart of town. Then came the fire. The fire took place on November 3, 1836. The date that was frequently noted in Elijah's journals was underlined so many times that the paper had begun to tear in certain areas. According to the official report, the fire originated in the kitchen of the Thornhill residence at approximately 2 a.m., rapidly spreading throughout the wooden structure. By the time the neighbors had organized a bucket brigade, the entire building was already engulfed in flames. Margaret Thornhill perished in her bed on the 2nd floor, while her 2 daughters, Emily and Catherine, lost their lives in the nursery they shared. Elijah managed to survive because he had been working late in his study, a small building separate from the main house. However, there was more to this narrative. Details began to surface gradually in the weeks that followed the tragedy. The fire was not an accident. Investigators discovered signs of forced entry through a rear window and traces of lamp oil arranged in patterns that were inconsistent with typical household usage. On that same night, 3 families of enslaved individuals from the Caldwell plantation, which was adjacent to the Thornhill property, managed to escape. The timing was not merely coincidental. The fire served as a diversion designed to attract attention while the escapees made their way north along routes that were just beginning to evolve into what would later be known as the Underground Railroad. The Caldwell family never forgave the devastation that the escape had inflicted upon their neighbors. Similarly, several other plantation families viewed the incident as proof that enslaved individuals could not be trusted. They believed that the abolitionist sentiments gradually spreading south from the northern states were corrupting previously established norms. Loyal employees. However, more than anyone else, Elijah Thornhill could not forgive what had been taken from him. He vanished from Montgomery society right after the funeral. He sold his property on Court Street for a mere fraction of its worth, acquired a secluded tract to the west of town, and completely withdrew from public life. For 15 years he was seen only sporadically, always by himself, buying supplies in town or managing cotton transactions through intermediaries. He did not employ anyone. His fields lay fallow. The few visitors who ventured to his estate reported that he turned them away at the gate, speaking through the bars without opening them. What Elijah engaged in during those 15 years of solitude remained a mystery until the federal inspector reviewed his journals. The pages, filled with cramped handwriting that became increasingly difficult to read as the years went by, revealed an obsession that consumed every waking moment. He had dedicated those years to researching, documenting, and planning. The journals contained names, dozens of them, arranged into family trees that sprawled across multiple pages. Birth dates, marriage records, property transactions, business partnerships, all meticulously recorded and cross-referenced. At the heart of this intricate web of information were 5 families: the Caldwells, the Harpers, the Suttons, the Bradfords, and the Reynolds. All were prominent plantation owners in Montgomery County, each with connections, either through business or marriage, to the escape that led to the fire that claimed the lives of Elijah's family. All of them had, at different times, owned or employed particular individuals whose names frequently appeared in Elijah's notes, circled and annotated with dates and locations. On February 28, 1852, 15 years and 4 months after the fire that devastated his family, Elijah Thornhill emerged from his self-imposed seclusion and attended a slave auction in Montgomery. This auction was the largest of the season, featuring over 60 individuals being sold to settle the estate of a bankrupt plantation owner from Selma. Elijah arrived early, before most buyers had gathered, and spent 3 hours scrutinizing the women available for purchase. According to the auctioneer's records preserved in the county clerk's office, Elijah acquired 7 women in a single transaction. The purchase price was notably high, at $3,000, which was more than double the typical cost for such a purchase. The women ranged in age from 19 to 34. Their names, as documented in the bill of sale, were Hannah, Ruth, Leah, Denina, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca. What the auctioneer failed to record, but what would later become evident, was that Elijah had not selected these women at random. Each of them had a distinct connection to the 5 families whose names filled his journals. Hannah had been born on the Caldwell plantation before being sold to the Selma estate. Ruth was the daughter of a woman who had served in the Harper household. Leah had spent her childhood on the Sutton property. Denina, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca each had similar backgrounds. Connections to the families that Elijah had been observing for 15 years. The 7 women departed the auction in a wagon that Elijah had provided for this purpose, and they vanished behind the gates of Thornhill Estate. For 3 months, no unusual occurrences were reported. Elijah was spotted in town on 2 occasions, buying supplies in amounts that indicated he was finally utilizing his land. Neighbors observed smoke consistently rising from the estate's chimneys, marking the first time in years that the house seemed inhabited. Then, on May 19, 1852, Elijah Thornhill entered the office of Judge Samuel Wickham and submitted a marriage certificate. He had wed Hannah, one of the 7 women, in a private ceremony officiated by a circuit preacher who passed through the area monthly. The marriage was legal, albeit shocking, but nonetheless legal. Alabama law allowed such unions, although they were uncommon and socially frowned upon. Judge Wickham recorded the certificate without remark. Yet by that evening, every household within Montgomery's elite circles was abuzz with the scandal. A plantation owner marrying an enslaved woman was not unheard of, but it was profoundly transgressive, particularly for a man of Elijah's previous social standing. The Methodist Church, which he had not attended in 15 years, dispatched a delegation to converse with him. He declined to meet with them. Former business associates crossed the street to avoid acknowledging him. Even those who might have empathized with his prolonged isolation now regarded him with suspicion and disdain. However, Elijah displayed no indication of concern regarding public opinion. He and Hannah were observed together on 2 occasions in town during the summer, strolling side by side, a behavior that contravened the social conventions of the time. Witnesses described Hannah as tall and reserved, possessing features that conveyed both intelligence and fatigue in equal parts. She donned simple, dark-colored dresses and a bonnet that obscured much of her face. In public, she refrained from speaking, at least in instances where witnesses could attest to it. The fate of the other 6 women became a topic of fervent speculation. They were never seen in town. No one reported hearing or observing them laboring in the fields. The estate remained as secluded as it had been during Elijah's years of isolation, showing no evidence of the activity that 7 additional inhabitants should have generated. The first letter reached the marshal's office on July 2, 1852. It was penned in meticulous script on inexpensive paper, unsigned, and simply stated, "6 women are being held against their will at the Thornhill estate. They are in danger. Someone must investigate." The marshal, an elderly gentleman named Walter Gaines, perused the letter and filed it away. Enslaved individuals were considered property, and if Elijah Thornhill opted to keep his property secluded, that was within his legal rights. 2 additional letters arrived in August, 3 in September, and 5 in October. Each contained similar allegations, articulated differently, yet conveying the same fundamental assertion. The women were captives. They were suffering harm. Action was required. Marshal Gaines disregarded all. Several notable citizens, including members of the Caldwell and Harper families, also received anonymous correspondence. These letters were more detailed, naming individuals and implying that the families were in some way accountable for the events occurring at the Thornhill estate. It was the letter directed to the federal office in Mobile that ultimately triggered action. Dated November 14, 1852, this letter included not only allegations, but also specific references to property law and interstate commerce, indicating that the writer possessed legal expertise. The correspondence contended that if Elijah Thornhill was detaining individuals against their will, it would represent a breach of property rights belonging to the original proprietors. Given that the women had been acquired at an estate sale linked to bankruptcy and interstate dealings, federal jurisdiction could potentially be invoked. Although the argument was tenuous and barely legal, it succeeded in capturing the interest of Inspector Thomas Calloway, a federal agent engaged in the investigation of illicit slave trading activities along the Gulf Coast. Calloway was recognized for his meticulousness and his readiness to pursue cases overlooked by local authorities. He arrived in Montgomery on September 3, 1853, 17 months after Elijah had acquired the 7 women. What Calloway uncovered in the subsequent weeks would reveal a reality far more unsettling than anyone had anticipated. A scheme so meticulously orchestrated that it had been functioning in plain view while the entire community averted its gaze. Inspector Thomas Calloway was not what Montgomery's establishment expected. He was 31 years of age, lean and clean-shaven during a time when most men sported beards, and he carried himself with the assurance of someone who had learned not to be daunted by wealth or social standing. He had been raised in Philadelphia, the offspring of a printer, and had joined the Federal Marshal Service at the age of 23, primarily working on cases related to customs fraud and illicit trade. His assignment to investigate irregularities in slave trading had occurred almost by chance, stemming from a case involving fraudulent bills of sale that had traversed state lines. He checked into the Exchange Hotel on Commerce Street, a 3-story brick establishment that functioned as the hub of Montgomery's business district. The owner, a thin-faced individual named Arnold Hughes, regarded Calloway with barely concealed skepticism. Federal agents were not typical visitors to Montgomery, and their presence generally signified trouble for someone. Calloway dedicated his initial 3 days to reviewing documents at the county clerk's office. He scrutinized the bill of sale from the February auction, property records pertaining to the Thornhill estate, and tax records dating back to 1837. He also sought access to court records associated with the 1836 fire, a request that raised eyebrows but was approved after Calloway invoked federal authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause. The clerk, a young man named David Patterson, who clearly relished gossip, turned out to be a valuable source of information. Mr. Thornhill was a different individual prior to the fire, Patterson remarked, leaning across his desk conspiratorially. He owned one of the largest cotton factoring businesses in the city and held contracts with plantations throughout the state. However, following the death of his family, he ceased operations, liquidated all his assets, settled his debts, and vanished into that estate. My father attempted to visit him around 1840 to discuss a business issue. Thornhill met him at the gate, armed with a shotgun, and instructed him to leave and never return. "Did anyone ever conduct a more thorough investigation into the fire?" Calloway inquired. "The records indicate it was arson, but I do not see any arrests made." Patterson shook his head. Marshal Gaines looked into it for about a week before declaring it unsolvable. The enslaved individuals who escaped that night were never located. They likely reached free territory, possibly Ohio or Pennsylvania. The Caldwell family advocated for a more extensive investigation, but it never materialized. "I believe people simply wanted to move on and forget the entire sordid affair." Calloway took notes in the small leather journal he carried. "What about the women Thornhill acquired? Has anyone encountered them?" "Only Hannah, the one he married, created a significant scandal when he submitted that marriage certificate." Judge Wickham was outraged, but the law is the law. Regarding the others, Patterson lowered his voice even further. "There have been whispers. Some individuals claim to hear screams at night emanating from the estate, but it is sufficiently distant from any other residences that it could merely be the wind or animals." The letters began arriving about a month after he brought them home. They were all anonymous. Marshal Gaines possesses an entire file. "Two would like to review that file," Calloway stated. Marshal Gaines was less accommodating than the clerk. At 64 years of age, he had been in his role for 30 years and made it evident that he perceived Calloway's presence as a challenge to his authority. "I have read those letters," Gaines remarked, seated behind his desk with his arms crossed. "Every single one of them. They are the product of abolitionists attempting to incite unrest. Likely authored by the same individual, perhaps someone who escaped north years ago seeking vengeance." "The handwriting differs considerably among the letters," Calloway noted. "I identified at least 4 distinct styles." Gaines dismissed this with a wave. "They are collaborating. The crux of the matter is that there is no proof of any wrongdoing. Thornhill acquired those women legally. What he chooses to do with his property is his concern, even if that property consists of individuals being held against their will." "They're slaves," Gaines stated bluntly. "Keeping them against their will is the very definition of slavery. If you wish to alter that, address Congress, not me." Calloway exited the marshal's office with the letters that Gaines had reluctantly handed over after Calloway threatened to return with a federal warrant. Upon returning to the hotel, Calloway laid the letters out on his bed and examined them closely. Patterson had been correct regarding the varying handwriting. However, there was more to uncover. The letters indicated knowledge that implied multiple sources, offering different viewpoints on the situation at the estate. Some expressed concerns for the safety of the women. Others referred to specific dates when events transpired. One correspondence dated March 15, 1853 remarked, "One of them is gone now. Disappeared like she never existed. No one asks questions because no one wants to know." The expression, "like she never existed," piqued Calloway's interest. He examined the auction records and tallied the names. 7 women had made purchases. Subsequently, he reviewed the property tax assessment for the Thornhill estate from 1853, which included a count of enslaved individuals on the property for taxation purposes. The count was 6. One woman was officially absent from the records, and no one had observed or cared. Calloway resolved it was time to visit the Thornhill estate. The road leading to the property was worse than he had expected, rutted and overgrown, evidently not maintained for regular use. His rented horse navigated cautiously through the ruts as oak trees encroached on both sides, their branches creating a canopy that obstructed most of the afternoon sunlight. The temperature noticeably dropped in the shade, and the air was redolent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The gate emerged after a 20-minute ride, a simple barrier of iron bars positioned between 2 brick pillars. It was closed, yet not locked. Calloway dismounted and pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. The house stood another 100 yards down the path, precisely as described. White paint faded to gray, shutters drawn, and an overall sense of neglect despite the smoke rising from one of the chimneys. As Calloway neared, the front door swung open. Elijah Thornhill stepped out. Upon reaching the porch, Calloway's initial impression was of a man who appeared to have aged significantly beyond his 48 years. Elijah looked gaunt, with his dark coat hanging loosely on a frame that had evidently lost a considerable amount of weight. His hair was entirely gray now, pulled back and secured at the nape of his neck. However, his eyes remained sharp and focused, tracking Calloway's every movement with an intensity that bordered on predatory. "Inspector Calloway," Elijah greeted. His voice was rough, as if it had not been used for some time. "I was wondering when you would arrive." Calloway halted at the base of the porch steps. "You were anticipating my arrival. Someone like you would eventually expect it." Elijah slowly descended the steps, ensuring his hands remained visible. "The letters would ultimately reach someone who cared enough to look into the matter." "I am surprised it took this long. Did you compose the letters yourself?" "No." Elijah paused 3 feet from Calloway. "But I am aware of who did. Several individuals, in fact, each with their own motives for wanting attention drawn to this location." "I would like to see the women you purchased," Calloway stated directly. "All 7 of them." A flicker of something crossed Elijah's expression, too fleeting to identify. "Certainly, though I must correct you. There are only 6 women present, in addition to my wife Hannah. One of the original 7 succumbed to fever last March. I reported it to the county clerk, but it seems the tax assessment was not updated." Calloway made a note. "I will need to see the death certificate. I do not possess one. She was interred on the property. Circuit preachers do not issue death certificates for enslaved individuals. Inspector, you are aware of that." It was indeed accurate. Technically, it was beneficial for Elijah's narrative. "Therefore, I will need to ascertain her burial location." "Certainly. However, first you should meet the others. They are working at the rear of the house." Elijah guided Calloway around the side of the structure along a dirt path that indicated recent foot traffic. The backyard was more expansive than Calloway had anticipated. Perhaps an acre of cleared land featuring several buildings, including a smokehouse, a root cellar with sloped doors, and a long, low structure that could have served as quarters for the servants. 6 women were visible, 3 tending to a vegetable garden near the tree line, 2 transporting water buckets from a well, and 1 hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. All of them looked up as Elijah and Calloway approached, and Calloway noticed the same expression on each face: fear. Not the usual fatigue that enslaved individuals exhibited around white strangers, but a sharp, immediate fear. One of the women near the well dropped her bucket, causing water to spill across the ground. "These are Ruth, Leah, Dina, Judith, and Naomi," Elijah said, gesturing vaguely toward the women. "And that is Rebecca at the laundry line. My wife Hannah is inside preparing dinner." "I would like to speak with them," Calloway stated. Individually, if feasible, Elijah's expression tightened slightly. "On what basis?" "Federal investigation into potential breaches of property law and interstate commerce regulations. They are my property, Inspector, acquired through legal means. I have not engaged in any unlawful activities. Therefore, you should have no concerns." Calloway maintained a steady tone. "I simply need to confirm that the women are here voluntarily, or more accurately, that they are being held in accordance with legal requirements." The ridiculousness of the term "their own will" lingered in the space between them. Both men were aware that enslaved individuals possessed no legal autonomy, yet the pretense had to be upheld. Elijah pondered for a considerable time before slowly nodding. "You may converse with them, but I will be present during the discussions." "That is unacceptable. In that case, you will require a warrant, Inspector. And considering that I have committed no offense, I doubt you will obtain one from Judge Wickham." He was likely correct. Calloway adjusted his strategy. "Allow me to speak with your wife, then." "Surely you have no objections to my speaking with Hannah." Elijah's jaw clenched, the first genuine indication of emotion Calloway had observed. "Hannah is my wife." "She is not involved in your inquiry. She is one of the 7 women acquired at auction. Thus, she is directly pertinent." For several moments, Elijah remained motionless. The women in the yard had become utterly still, observing the standoff with expressions that indicated they comprehended precisely what was at stake. Then Elijah abruptly turned and headed toward the house. "Come inside, Inspector. You may speak with Hannah in the parlor." 5 minutes, no more. Calloway followed him into the house. The interior was dimly lit, illuminated only by a few windows where the shutters had been partially opened. The furniture was minimal yet well crafted. A settee, 2 chairs, and a small table were present. Everything appeared meticulously clean, albeit worn, as if it had been utilized for decades without any replacements. The air was infused with the scent of wood smoke and an unidentified bitter herbal aroma that Calloway could not place. Hannah emerged from what seemed to be the kitchen. She was tall, as described by the witnesses, possessing dark skin and features indicative of mixed African and indigenous ancestry. She donned a simple gray dress with a white collar, and her hair was neatly pulled back under a blue headscarf. For a brief moment, her eyes met Calloway's before she lowered them to the floor, a practiced gesture of submission. "Hannah, this is Inspector Calloway," Elijah introduced. "He wishes to ask you some questions. You are to respond truthfully." "Yes, sir," Hannah replied softly. Elijah positioned himself near the doorway, close enough to hear every word while maintaining the illusion of privacy. Calloway took a seat in one of the chairs and motioned for Hannah to occupy the settee. She perched on the edge of the cushion, her hands folded in her lap, her posture tense. "How long have you been here, Hannah?" Calloway inquired gently. "Since February of last year, sir." "That makes it a year and 7 months?" "And you married Mr. Thornhill 3 months after your arrival?" "Yes, sir." "Was that your decision?" Hannah's gaze flickered towards Elijah before returning to her hands. "He asked me to marry him, sir." I said, "Yes." "Were you afraid of what could occur if you declined?" Elijah's voice resonated throughout the room. "Inspector, you are guiding the witness." Calloway disregarded him. "Hannah, are you present here against your will?" "Do you wish to depart?" For the first time, Hannah met his gaze directly, and what Calloway discerned in her eyes was not fear, but something far more intricate. Exhaustion, resignation, and perhaps a hint of bitter amusement. "I am a slave, Inspector. I follow orders and comply with directives. My will does not factor into this. However, you are also Mr. Thornhill's spouse. That affords you certain legal protections, does it not?" Hannah's tone remained subdued but now bore an edge. "I was not aware that marriage altered the color of my skin or the laws of this state." Calloway leaned in closer. "If any illegal activities are occurring here, I can assist, but I require you to be truthful with me." Hannah remained silent for a considerable time. Then she spoke very deliberately. "Nothing illegal is transpiring here, Inspector. Everything Mr. Thornhill has done is lawful. You can confirm that yourself." The wording was peculiar, intentional. Calloway understood what she was not articulating as clearly as what she was. Legal and moral are not synonymous. "What transpired with Rebecca?" Calloway inquired abruptly. "The 7th woman?" Hannah's demeanor did not shift, but her hands clenched in her lap. "She fell ill last March, fever. She passed away within a week. We interred her in the woods." "I would like to visit the grave." "Certainly," Elijah responded from the doorway, "as I mentioned earlier. But first, Inspector, your 5 minutes are up." Calloway stood up with reluctance. He had learned something, although he was uncertain about what it was. Hannah's careful choice of words, the fear evident on the faces of the other women, and the single woman who had conveniently succumbed to fever, all of these elements indicated that something was profoundly amiss at the Thornhill estate. However, wrong and illegal are not synonymous, particularly in Alabama in 1853. Elijah guided him back outside and across the yard towards the tree line. The 6 women had resumed their tasks, yet Calloway sensed their gaze upon him as he walked by. None of them uttered a word or made eye contact. The grave lay 100 yards into the woods, marked by a simple wooden cross devoid of a name. The earth appeared settled, implying that the burial had taken place months ago, as asserted. Calloway scrutinized the site meticulously but discovered nothing out of the ordinary. If Rebecca had indeed died of fever and been interred here, this is precisely how it would appear. "Satisfied?" Elijah inquired. "Not in the slightest," Calloway replied. "However, I will require more evidence before I can move forward. I plan to remain in Montgomery for the foreseeable future. I may return with further inquiries. You are welcome at any time, Inspector. As you can observe, I have nothing to conceal." Yet, as Calloway rode back towards Montgomery, with the afternoon sun filtering through the trees and the sounds of the estate receding behind him, he was aware that Elijah Thornhill was concealing something. The question remained what it was, and whether it was illegal enough to warrant federal intervention. The answer would emerge from an unexpected source. One of the women from the estate communicated through words she had penned months prior, anticipating someone to discover them. Inspector Calloway dedicated the following week to conducting interviews across Montgomery. He engaged with the auctioneer who had sold the 7 women to Elijah, merchants who had provided goods to the estate over the previous year, neighbors whose properties adjoined Thornhill land, and members of the 5 families whose names frequently surfaced in relation to the 1836 fire. The auctioneer, a stout man named Porter Williams, recalled the transaction vividly. "Never encountered anything like it," Williams stated, seated in his office above a tobacco shop. A man enters, examines every woman we have on offer, then selects 7 specific ones, paying a premium price without any negotiation. Typically, buyers wish to haggle, especially for such a large number at once. However, Mr. Thornhill simply counted out the cash and requested an immediate transfer of ownership. He had a wagon waiting outside. Did he provide any explanation for his choice of those particular women? William shook his head. I didn't inquire. To be honest, I didn't care. A sale is a sale. Although I did observe that he spent considerable time conversing with each of them before reaching his decision. He asked them about their backgrounds, where they had worked, and who their families were. Most buyers do not concern themselves with such details. Did the women appear to be afraid of him? No more than they were afraid of anyone else. They were being sold, Inspector. Fear was the predominant emotion in that room, irrespective of who was making the purchase. The merchants provided similar narratives. Elijah had been a consistent patron since the prior February, acquiring supplies in amounts that indicated he was finally utilizing his land. Flour, sugar, salt, lamp oil, fabric, tools, seeds. Nothing out of the ordinary except for the quantities, which were greater than what would be required for 8 individuals, yet not alarmingly so. The neighbors were less cooperative. The closest property was 3/4 of a mile away, owned by a farmer named Douglas Pritchard, who cultivated tobacco and raised pigs. Not much to see from over there, Pritchard remarked. The trees are too dense and I keep to myself. I heard he married one of his slaves, which is his business, not mine. I haven't heard any screams or observed anything unusual, if that is what you are inquiring about. Are you certain? No strange noises at night? Pritchard paused. Well, there was one night, perhaps back in April or May. I heard something that could have been a woman crying, but it was distant. It might have been an animal. It didn't last long. I mentioned it to my wife, and she suggested it was probably just an owl. We dismissed it. The discussions with the 5 families were particularly intriguing, especially due to what they chose not to disclose. Richard Caldwell, the head of the Caldwell plantation, welcomed Calloway into a drawing room filled with the scent of cigar smoke and the aura of old wealth. He was 71 years old, corpulent and red-faced, with hands that quivered slightly as he raised a glass of whiskey to his mouth. Thornhill's a madman, Caldwell stated candidly. He always was, even before the fire was excessively intense, overly concentrated on trivial matters. The death of his family shattered whatever remnants of his sanity remained. Marrying a woman of servitude is merely the latest indication of his madness. Have you received any anonymous correspondence regarding the conditions at his estate? Caldwell's demeanor darkened. I have received several such letters. All of them are nonsensical, attempting to implicate me in the delusions that Thornhill is experiencing. I had no involvement in that fire. Inspector, my property suffered damage as well. 3 barns were consumed when the wind changed direction. Indeed, some of my people managed to escape that night, but they were recaptured within a month. This situation has nothing to do with me. The letters imply otherwise. These letters were penned by abolitionists, or possibly by Thornhill himself, to elicit sympathy. Regardless, they are inconsequential. If you wish to investigate a crime, focus on Thornhill's misappropriation of property. The women he acquired originated from an estate that was fraudulently settled. There are liens against that sale that were never addressed. It was a diversion, clumsy and obvious, yet it revealed something significant. Caldwell appeared concerned. Calloway noted that information and proceeded to the next family. The same pattern emerged with the Harpers, Suttons, Bradfords, and Reynolds. All had received anonymous letters. All dismissed them as malicious fabrications. All asserted they had no ties to Elijah Thornhill beyond the peripheral connection established by the fire of 1836. And all of them, without exception, seemed eager to conclude the matter. Conversations were conducted as swiftly as possible. On the 8th day of his inquiry, Calloway received a message at his hotel. It was delivered by a young black boy, likely around 10 years of age, who handed him a folded note and fled before Calloway could pose any questions. The note was inscribed in neat, educated handwriting. If you wish to comprehend the events occurring at the Thornhill estate, scrutinize the property records for the 5 families. Pay particular attention to transfers that took place in late 1836 and early 1837. The truth lies hidden in plain sight. Calloway returned to Clark's office and requested all property records for the 5 families spanning the period from November 1836 to June 1837. David Patterson retrieved 3 substantial ledgers and laid them out on a reading table. This will require some time, Pysonson remarked. These families possess considerable holdings. What precisely are you searching for? I'll recognize it when I encounter it, Calloway replied. He toiled through the afternoon and into the evening until Patterson had to illuminate lamps to proceed. The records were intricate and challenging to decipher, filled with legal jargon and abbreviations that necessitated Patterson's assistance to interpret. However, gradually a pattern began to surface. In the 6 months following the fire, all 5 families had engaged in significant property transfers. The Caldwells had sold 3 enslaved individuals to a plantation in Georgia. The Harpers had sold 5 to a purchaser in Louisiana. The Suttons, Bradfords, and Reynolds had executed similar transactions, each selling or transferring small numbers of enslaved individuals to far-off locations. Each transaction on its own was unremarkable. Plantation families routinely bought and sold slaves, often driven by financial motives or to punish by separating families. However, when viewed collectively, the pattern indicated something more significant. The 5 families had been methodically extracting specific individuals from their estates and dispatching them to places where inquiries about the events of the night of the fire could not be made. Calloway compiled a list of names from the transfer records and subsequently cross-referenced them with the names found in Elijah's journals, which he had obtained from the estate during his initial visit. The correlation was remarkable. Almost every individual sold or transferred by the 5 families in early 1837 was documented in Elijah's detailed research notes. Furthermore, there was additional information. Among the names were familial connections that traced back to the 7 women Elijah had acquired in 1852. Hannah's mother had been owned by the Caldwells and relocated to Georgia in January 1837. Ruth's grandmother had been employed by the Harpers and sold to Louisiana. Leah, Denina, Judith, Naomi, and Rebecca all shared similar ties, familial connections to individuals who had been present on or near the properties during the night of the fire and were subsequently removed. Elijah had not selected these 7 women at random. He had chosen them based on their family backgrounds, considering what those families might have known regarding the occurrences of November 3, 1836. The following morning, Calloway returned to the Thornhill estate was visited unexpectedly. Elijah was tending to the vegetable garden, securing tomato plants with strips of cloth. He glanced up as Calloway approached, but continued his work. "Back so soon, Inspector? I believed our business was concluded." "I would like to review your journals," Calloway stated. "The ones you maintained during your 15 years of isolation." Elijah slowly straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "My journals are private property, Inspector. You have no legal claim to them. I am not requesting a right. I am seeking your cooperation. Unless you would prefer that I return with federal marshals and a warrant that permits me to search every corner of this property." The threat lingered in the air between them. Elijah scrutinized Calloway's expression for a lengthy moment before nodding toward the house. "Come inside." The study was located on the 2nd floor, a small room featuring a single window that overlooked the backyard. 3 walls were lined with shelves filled with ledgers, journals, and loose papers, organized in stacks tied with string. A desk was positioned beneath the window, its surface cluttered with maps of Montgomery County and the surrounding area. Elijah pulled a wooden chair away from the desk and motioned for Calloway to take a seat. "These represent 15 years of my life," Elijah said softly, gliding his hand along one shelf. "Every day documented, every detail recorded. What precisely do you hope to uncover?" "The truth regarding why you purchased those 7 women." Elijah selected 3 journals from the shelf and placed them on the desk. Then read, "Inspector. But be aware that what you finding will not alter anything. I have not violated any laws." Calloway opened the initial journal and commenced reading. The entry began in late November 1836, merely days following the fire. The handwriting was initially unsteady, reflecting the emotions of a man in profound sorrow. "Margaret is no longer here. Emily is no longer here. Catherine is no longer here. The house has turned to ash. I am left with nothing but inquiries and a desire for answers." The subsequent entries detailed Elijah's spiral into obsession. He had engaged investigators, conducted interviews with witnesses, and devoted weeks to reconstructing the events of that fateful night. The escape from the Caldwell plantation had been meticulously planned for months, orchestrated by an unidentified organizer with connections throughout the plantation network in Montgomery County. The fire at Elijah's residence was not an accident or incidental damage. It was intentional, ignited by someone familiar with the layout of his property, who understood that the fire would act as a diversion while the escapees made their way northward. But who was responsible for it? The investigators uncovered no definitive evidence, and the Caldwell family exerted pressure on the authorities to expedite the closure of the case. Too many inquiries regarding the escape could unveil uncomfortable realities about security on their own plantation, including the potential that some of their trusted laborers had been plotting a rebellion. Elijah's journal indicated that he persisted in his investigation long after official avenues had ceased their efforts. He dedicated months, then years, to tracking down anyone who might possess relevant information. He had conducted interviews with field workers, domestic servants, overseers, and free black residents of Montgomery who may have been privy to rumors. Gradually and with great difficulty, he pieced together a narrative of the events that transpired. The escape was orchestrated by a network comprising both enslaved individuals and free black residents from the region. The fire at Elijah's residence was ignited by 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, all of whom had been employed on properties owned by the 5 families. The woman had served in the Caldwell household. 1 man had been employed by the Harpers, while the other had belonged to the Reynolds family. All 3 managed to escape that night and were never apprehended again, but Elijah had discovered their names: Samuel, Marcus, and Dinah. More significantly, he had also learned the names of their family members who remained in the vicinity. These were individuals who might have been aware of the plan, who could have provided assistance, and who bore the burden of guilt for what had transpired against his family. Calloway raised his gaze from the journal. "You have been tracing their descendants, their offspring, their siblings, and their cousins," Elijah affirmed. "Anyone who might possess knowledge of the events, anyone who could have heard confessions or witnessed evidence. Furthermore, the 7 women you acquired are all connected to those who escaped that night. Not all of them, but the majority." Elijah's tone was flat and devoid of emotion. "Hannah is the niece of Denina, the woman who ignited the fire. Ruth's father was Samuel's brother. Leah's mother was Marcus's cousin. The connections exist, Inspector, and they are documented in the records. Across 3 counties, I dedicated 15 years to locating them. Thus, this is an act of revenge," Calloway stated. "You purchased these women as a means of punishing them for the actions of their relatives." Elijah's demeanor remained unchanged. "I acquired them to uncover the truth. Their families possess narratives, memories that have been transmitted through generations. I needed to listen to those narratives. And did they reveal to you what you sought to know?" For the first time, a semblance of pain appeared on Elijah's face. "Some of them did. Hannah had more knowledge than the others. Her Aunt Dina had recounted the events of that night to her family before she fled north. The fire was intended merely as a diversion, nothing beyond that. They were unaware that anyone was present in the house. My study was detached from the main residence, and they presumed I was there, that I would be secure. They never meant to take the lives of my wife and daughters." The words lingered in the small room, and Calloway felt a shiver despite the warm afternoon air. Yet they perished regardless. "They perished regardless," Elijah echoed softly. "And Dina, Samuel, and Marcus escaped to freedom while I laid my family to rest." The 5 families assisted in concealing the incident, ensuring that no one probed too deeply, as they wished to avoid scrutiny regarding how enslaved individuals on their estates had orchestrated such a successful escape. They sold off anyone who might speak out, dispersed the witnesses throughout the South, and closed ranks. Calloway shut the journal. "So, you have devoted 15 years to plotting revenge. What did you do to these women, Elijah? What became of Rebecca?" Elijah turned away. Gazing out the window towards the backyard, I observed the 6 women as they continued their tasks. "I assure you, Inspector, I have committed no illegal acts. Everything I have done is in accordance with the laws of this state and this nation. This is the harsh reality you must come to terms with. That does not constitute an answer. It is the sole response you will receive from me." Elijah's tone grew stern. "If you seek further information, inquire with the women themselves. Ask Hannah. She will disclose the truth, all of it. Provided you pose the appropriate questions." Calloway rose, his frustration escalating. "I am inquiring right now." "What transpired with Rebecca?" Elijah met his gaze unwaveringly. "She succumbed to fever, as I previously informed you. She lies buried in the woods, as you have seen. Everything beyond that is mere conjecture and suspicion. Inspector, you possess no proof of any crime, for no crime has occurred. Then what of the anonymous letters? Why would someone go to such lengths to attract attention here if no illegal activities are taking place? For the first time, Elijah smiled, and it was one of the most disconcerting expressions Calloway had ever encountered. Because at times, Inspector, the law and justice do not align, and often those who grasp this concept most profoundly are the individuals who endure the greatest suffering under the law's safeguard. That afternoon, Calloway departed the estate with copies of several journal pages that Elijah had permitted him to take, yet he found no tangible evidence of misconduct. The journals unveiled obsession, sorrow, and a 15-year strategy to compile information regarding those accountable for his family's demise, but they disclosed no crimes. Upon returning to his hotel, he spread the documents across his bed and endeavored to comprehend what he had learned. Elijah had acquired 7 women associated with the families of those who had fled in 1836. He had taken one of them as his wife. One had perished under enigmatic circumstances. The others remained on his estate, evidently frightened, yet not physically harmed in ways that left any evidence. What was Elijah's true intention? Was it merely to interrogate these women to uncover the truth about that night? Or was there something more sinister occurring? Something that left no legal record? The revelation arrived 3 days later from an unforeseen source. The woman appeared at Calloway's hotel room door just after dawn on September 19, 1853. She was petite and elderly, possibly around 70 years old, with gray hair secured beneath a faded yellow headscarf. Her hands trembled as she held a folded piece of paper against her chest. "Inspector Calloway." Her voice was scarcely above a whisper. "Yes, how may I assist you? I possess something you need to see. Something Hannah entrusted to me to deliver to you, but only in the event that she could not come herself." Calloway opened the door wider. "Please, come in." The woman entered cautiously, glancing back down the hallway as if she feared being pursued. She perched on the edge of the sole chair in the room, her posture tense with anxiety. "My name is Abigail Tate. I am a free woman employed as a seamstress here in town. Hannah approached me 6 months ago, requesting that I keep this paper safe. She mentioned that if anything were to happen to her, or if a federal inspector came inquiring, I was meant to give it to him." She passed the paper to Calloway. It was soft from repeated folding and unfolding, with frayed edges. The handwriting was meticulous and surprisingly educated, inscribed in ink that had faded to a brown hue. "My name is Hannah. I am composing this in March of 1853, 1 year after Master Thornhill acquired me and 6 other women at auction. I am penning this because I fear I may not endure what is transpiring here, and someone must be aware of the truth. Master Thornhill is not a cruel man in the manner that most people comprehend cruelty. He does not inflict physical harm upon us or deprive us of food. The house is comfortable. We have sufficient food and clothing, yet we are captives in ways far more dreadful than chains. He wed me 3 months after our arrival because he required a wife to make his scheme appear normal to the community. However, the marriage is merely a facade. He has never engaged with me as a husband would with a wife. He has never raised his voice at me, yet each day he poses inquiries. Inquiries regarding my Aunt Dina, about what she conveyed to my mother before she fled north. Inquiries concerning the night of the fire, about who was aware of what and when. Inquiries about the other families, about the connections between laborers on various plantations, about how information circulated within the community. Initially, I attempted to refrain from answering. Then I came to the realization that resistance was futile. He was already aware of most of what he inquired. He had dedicated 15 years to researching, documenting, and constructing a narrative of that night and the network of individuals who facilitated the escape. He merely sought confirmation, details, and the human narratives behind the facts he had gathered. Therefore, I conveyed to him all that I knew regarding my Aunt Dina. I explained how she had been involved in the planning for several months. I described how the fire was intended solely as a diversion. I recounted how she never forgave herself for the fatalities of Master Thornhill's wife and daughters. I informed him about the 5 families and how they had concealed the escape to safeguard their own reputations. I shared every tale my mother had recounted to me, every rumor I had encountered, and every connection I was aware of. Upon concluding my account, he expressed his gratitude. Subsequently, he took Ruth to his study and began posing the same inquiries to her. I realized that we were not present to face punishment. Instead, we were here to be documented. Master Thornhill is compiling a record of the events, narrated through the voices of those whose families were implicated. He treats us with kindness because he requires us to remain healthy and clear-headed. He married me because he needed someone he could rely on to assist him with his endeavors. However, Rebecca refused to comply. She would not engage with him, nor would she respond to his questions. She stated that her grandmother had escaped north, and she would not betray her memory by aiding the man whose family had perished during that escape. Master Thornhill did not compel her. He did not impose any punishment. He merely ceased to provide her with food. This occurred gradually. Initially, her portions were reduced. Then she was given only bread and water. Finally, for 3 days, she received nothing at all. We attempted to share our food with her, but Master Thornhill observed us incessantly. Any of the food we provided to her was taken from our own servings. The following day, Rebecca grew weaker. She pleaded with him to allow her to speak, to convey what he wished to know. However, by that time, she was too frail to recall clearly. The fever soon followed, induced by starvation and hopelessness. She passed away on March 11, 1853. We laid her to rest in the woods. Master Thornhill officiated a brief ceremony, reading from the Bible as if her death had been natural. And in the eyes of the law, perhaps it was. He never struck her. He never denied her water. He merely withheld food, which is within his legal rights as her owner. This is the manner in which Master Thornhill operates. He functions within the law while dismantling us from within. He weaponizes our own fear, our own hunger, our own desperation, and there is no crime in any of it. I am documenting this because I fear others may follow in Rebecca's footsteps. Leah has been inquiring, questioning why we must divulge everything to him, whether we might be feeding his obsession rather than satisfying it. Dinina has remained silent for 3 weeks now, refusing to speak. I am concerned for both of them. If you are reading this, Inspector Calloway, or whoever you may be, understand that Master Thornhill has committed no offense under the laws of Alabama or the United States. Yet he has constructed a hell that functions within those laws, a prison built from legal rights and property ownership. We are not beaten or worked to death. We are simply erased one by one through methods that leave no trace. I do not know if there is little that can be done to prevent him, yet at least now someone will be aware of the truth. The letter bore Hannah's signature and was dated March 17, 1853, 6 months prior to Calloway's arrival in Montgomery. He glanced at Abigail Tate, who observed him with a mixture of hope and despair in her eyes. "Why didn't Hannah come to me herself?" "She cannot leave the property," Abigail replied. "Master Thornhill does not secure the doors or chain anyone, but he maintains constant surveillance, and she is fearful. If he were to discover that she had authored this letter, if he were to learn that she had entrusted it to me, he would also cut off her food supply," Calloway concluded grimly. Abigail nodded in agreement. She remarked, "You appeared to be a man willing to assist, yet she also mentioned that you were constrained by the law, much like Master Thornhill." She was uncertain whether this letter would have any impact, but she felt compelled to make the attempt. Calloway reread the letter, his thoughts racing through legal precedents and federal statutes. The use of starvation as a means of control was not explicitly illegal when directed at enslaved individuals. Property owners were entitled to manage their property as they deemed appropriate, within very broad limits, provided that Elijah did not directly cause anyone's death. As long as he could assert that any fatalities were natural outcomes of illness or refusal to eat rather than intentional starvation, he was functioning within legal parameters. However, there must be some avenue, some approach that would permit federal intervention. "Abigail, I require you to undertake something for me," Calloway said with caution. "I require you to deliver a message to Hannah. Inform her that I will be returning to the estate this afternoon and that I need to have a private conversation with her. Advise her to find a way to be alone, away from Elijah, even if it is just for a few minutes. How she will accomplish that is uncertain to me, but if she possesses the intelligence that this letter implies, she will find a solution." Abigail exited through the rear entrance of the hotel, and Calloway dedicated the next 3 hours to strategizing his approach. He required evidence that would withstand scrutiny in federal court, something that clearly demonstrated a violation of property rights or interstate commerce regulations. Anna's letter served as compelling testimony, yet it was insufficient on its own. He needed tangible evidence, witnesses, something definitive. He arrived at the Thornhill estate at 2:00 p.m. Elijah was engaged in work at the smokehouse, preparing meat for winter preservation. He glanced up as Calloway neared, his expression remaining neutral. "Back again, Inspector. I'm starting to believe you take pleasure in our discussions. I must speak with Hannah once more, this time in private, without your presence." Elijah placed the knife he had been wielding down. "On what basis?" "On the basis that as your legal spouse, she possesses rights that supersede property law. I am investigating claims of abuse, and I require the opportunity to interview her without the accused being present." It was a tenuous argument, only marginally supported by legal precedent. However, Elijah contemplated it for a considerable time before slowly nodding. "Very well. Hannah is in the house preparing dinner. You may converse with her in the parlor. I will remain outside." Calloway found Hannah precisely where Elijah had indicated, engaged in the kitchen over a pot of stew. She glanced up as he entered, and their eyes connected. In that fleeting moment of contact, Calloway perceived recognition. She was aware that Abigail had delivered the letter. "Mrs. Thornhill," Calloway stated formally, "I require a private conversation with you. Your husband has granted permission for us to discuss matters in the parlor." Hannah dried her hands on her apron and accompanied him into the front room. Calloway positioned himself to observe the windows, ensuring that Elijah could not approach without being seen. Hannah settled on the settee, her demeanor more at ease than during their initial discussion. "You received my letter," she remarked softly. "It wasn't a question. I did. Abigail Tate brought it to me this morning. Then you are aware of the situation here. I know what you have informed me. However, I require more, Hannah. I need evidence that will withstand scrutiny in court. The letter outlines starvation, but unless I can demonstrate that Elijah intentionally withheld food with the aim to harm or kill Rebecca, it will not suffice to warrant federal intervention." Hannah's hands clenched in her lap. "What type of evidence?" "Witnesses, tangible proof, anything that illustrates a pattern of abuse beyond what property law permits. There are 6 of us who can testify. Isn't that sufficient? Not when you are all regarded as property under state law. Your testimony carries limited legal significance. I need something more." Hannah remained silent for a moment, gazing at her hands. Then she spoke very softly. "There is another letter. Rebecca composed it prior to her death. While she still possessed the strength, she concealed it in the root cellar beneath a loose board close to the back wall. I am aware of its location, but I cannot retrieve it without Master Thornhill noticing." Calloway's heart raced. "What does it contain?" "I am uncertain. She penned it in secrecy over a span of several days. She mentioned it was her testimony, her evidence of his actions. She stated, if anyone ever came to investigate, they should discover it and peruse its contents. Can you create a map for me indicating precisely where it is hidden?" Anna glanced towards the window, assessing Elijah's position. He remained visible near the smokehouse, his back facing the house. She extracted a scrap of paper from her apron pocket along with a pencil stub and swiftly sketched the layout of the root cellar. "Here," she indicated, marking a location near the back, 3 boards from the corner, loose on one end. "Lift it with care." Calloway accepted the paper. "I will need to conduct an official search of the property with Elijah's consent or with a warrant. He will never grant permission, and by the time you return with a warrant, the letter will have vanished. He inspects the cellar every few days. Then I will have to seek an alternative method." Calloway rose. "Hannah, what you have accomplished by writing that letter and delivering it to me is remarkably courageous. However, you must comprehend that even with Rebecca's testimony, I may not be able to extricate you from this property. The law safeguards. Elijah's rights as both your owner and your husband are acknowledged." "I understand." Hannah's tone was calm yet resigned. "However, at least someone will be aware of the truth. At least his actions will not remain concealed indefinitely." Calloway exited the parlor and searched for Elijah, who was cleansing his hands at the pump in the yard. "I need to conduct a thorough inspection of your property," Calloway stated, referring to the buildings, the cellar, and everything else. Elijah took his time drying his hands with a rag. "Do you possess a warrant, Inspector?" "I can obtain one." "Then proceed to get one. Until you possess the legal authority to search my property, I must refuse. As I have reiterated numerous times, I have not violated any laws. If you believe otherwise, provide evidence through the appropriate legal channels." Calloway returned to Montgomery, feeling frustrated yet not defeated. He had Hannah's letter, her account regarding Rebecca's concealed message, and an increasingly clear understanding of Elijah's tactics. While it may not suffice for a conviction, It could be adequate to compel a judge to issue a search warrant. That evening, he dedicated himself to drafting a formal request. Referencing Hannah's letter as evidence of the suspicious circumstances surrounding Rebecca's demise, contending that a comprehensive search of the property was essential to eliminate the possibility of foul play, he submitted it to Judge Wickham the following morning. Wickham perused the request slowly, his expression inscrutable. At 62 years of age, he was a seasoned figure in Alabama's legal system, recognized for his stringent interpretation of property rights. "Inspector Calloway," he finally remarked, "what you are outlining in this letter, if true, it is morally objectionable. However, I am uncertain if it breaches any particular statute. A woman has died under dubious circumstances, Your Honor. Federal law mandates an investigation when interstate property rights may be at stake. The woman was legally acquired at a state auction. Her demise transpired on private property. Unless you can prove that her death was caused by actions that contravene specific federal statutes, I do not perceive any basis for a warrant." "What of the testimony from the other women?" "They observed the events. They are slaves, Inspector. Their testimony holds no legal validity in Alabama courts. You are aware of this as well as I am." Calloway leaned forward. "Then amend the law, Your Honor, or at the very least permit me to seek evidence that could substantiate federal charges under interstate commerce statutes." Wickham remained silent for an extended period. Subsequently, he signed the warrant. "You have 24 hours, Inspector. Conduct a thorough search of the property, but be aware that unless you uncover clear evidence of violations that fall under federal jurisdiction, this investigation will conclude. I will not sanction any further intrusion on Mr. Thornhill's property rights based solely on moral objections to how he exercises those rights." Calloway accepted the warrant and returned to the Thornhill estate that same afternoon, accompanied by 2 federal marshals from Mobile, who had arrived that morning in response to his earlier request for assistance. Elijah greeted them at the gate, his expression inscrutable. "I possess a warrant," Calloway stated. "If true, it is morally objectionable. However, I am uncertain if it breaches any particular statute. A woman has died under dubious circumstances, Your Honor. Federal law mandates an investigation when interstate property rights may be at stake. The woman was legally acquired at a state auction. Her demise transpired on private property. Unless you can prove that her death was caused by actions that contravene specific federal statutes, I do not perceive any basis for a warrant." "What of the testimony from the other women?" "They observed the events. They are slaves, Inspector. Their testimony holds no legal validity in Alabama courts. You are aware of this as well as I am." Calloway leaned forward. "Then amend the law, Your Honor, or at the very least permit me to seek evidence that could substantiate federal charges under interstate commerce statutes." Wickham remained silent for an extended period. Subsequently, he signed the warrant. "You have 24 hours, Inspector. Conduct a thorough search of the property, but be aware that unless you uncover clear evidence of violations that fall under federal jurisdiction, this investigation will conclude. I will not sanction any further intrusion on Mr. Thornhill's property rights based solely on moral objections to how he exercises those rights." Calloway accepted the warrant and returned to the Thornhill estate that same afternoon, accompanied by 2 federal marshals from Mobile, who had arrived that morning in response to his earlier request for assistance. Elijah greeted them at the gate, his expression inscrutable. "I possess a warrant," Calloway said, handing over the document. Elijah examined it thoroughly, then opened the gate. "Search as you wish, Inspector. You will discover nothing unlawful." The search lasted for 3 hours. Calloway and the marshals scrutinized every building, every room, and every corner of the property. They located the grave in the woods precisely as described. They investigated the house, the smokehouse, the servants' quarters, and ultimately they searched the root cellar. The area was dim and cool, illuminated only by the lamp. Calloway carried shelves that lined the walls, stocked with preserved foods, root vegetables, and supplies. Calloway proceeded to the back corner, counting boards according to Hannah's map, 3 from the corner, loose on one end. He knelt and lifted it carefully. The board came up effortlessly, revealing a small hollow beneath. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and moisture. The ink was faded but still readable. Calloway unfolded it with care and began to read by lamplight. The handwriting was unsteady, weak, yet the words were clear. "My name is Rebecca. I am dying because I refused to disclose to Master Thornhill what he sought to know about my grandmother, who escaped north in 1836. He has neither beaten me nor worked me to death. He has merely ceased to feed me a little more each day until I am too feeble to stand. This is how he punishes disobedience. This is how he exerts control over us. By the time anyone reads this, I will be deceased. However, I wish for someone to understand that I chose death rather than betray my grandmother's memory. I want someone to know what Master Thornhill is acting within his legal rights. However, I wish for someone to recognize that we are human beings, not mere property, and we deserve to be remembered. The letter was dated March 9, 1853, just 2 days prior to Rebecca's death. According to Hannah's correspondence, Calloway emerged from the cellar holding the document, his mind racing with legal precedents. This served as evidence of intentional starvation, a written account from the victim herself. But was it sufficient? Rebecca had acknowledged in her own words that Elijah was operating within his legal rights. She had confessed to refusing to comply with his demands. Under Alabama law, Elijah was exercising his property rights, disciplining a disobedient slave by withholding food. Yet perhaps there was another perspective. Calloway discovered Elijah standing near the house, observing the search with an expression of patient tolerance. "I found Rebecca's letter," Calloway stated, "which detailed her testimony regarding how you starved her to death." "I did not starve her," Elijah replied calmly. "I merely reduced her rations as punishment for her disobedience. She succumbed to fever, weakened by her own refusal to consume what little was provided. The law permits owners to discipline their property as they deem appropriate. However, the law also has its limits. Even in Alabama, intentional starvation leading to death could be viewed as destruction of property belonging to the estate that sold her to you. This encroaches upon federal jurisdiction under interstate commerce law. It was a tenuous argument, barely supported by precedent. However, Elijah's expression became slightly more tense. "You are overreaching, Inspector." "Perhaps. Yet I now possess 2 letters. Written accounts from women who were present, along with probable cause to detain you while further investigations are conducted. You may choose to come voluntarily, or I can arrange for the marshals to escort you forcibly." For an extended moment, Elijah remained still. Eventually he nodded slowly. "I will come voluntarily. However, this will never reach trial, Inspector. You are aware of that as well as I am. No judge in Alabama will convict a white man for the manner in which he disciplines his property." "We shall see," Calloway replied. Nevertheless, as the marshals escorted Elijah away, he understood that the man was likely correct. The trial of Elijah Thornhill commenced on November 2, 1853, precisely 17 years and 1 day after the fire that had claimed his family's lives. It took place in federal court in Mobile, overseen by Judge Harrison Carmichael, one of the few federal judges in the area known for occasionally ruling against property owners in cases of evident abuse. The courtroom was filled with onlookers attracted by the sensational aspects of the case. A white man facing trial for starving his own slave to death, charged based on letters penned by enslaved women. The prosecution, spearheaded by Calloway and a federal attorney named Robert Ashton, constructed their case around Rebecca's letter and Hannah's testimony regarding the systematic manner in which Elijah had interrogated and controlled the 7 women. The defense was led by a distinguished Montgomery attorney named Charles Rutherford. It was contended that Elijah had acted within his legal rights as a property owner, that Rebecca had succumbed to fever rather than starvation, and that her own correspondence acknowledged her disobedience and refusal to consume the food provided to her. On the 3rd day of the trial, Hannah was summoned to testify. It was quite uncommon for an enslaved individual to provide testimony in any court, particularly in federal court. However, Judge Carmichael had determined that as Elijah's legal wife, Hannah possessed limited standing to offer testimony regarding occurrences within her household. She approached the stand dressed in a modest blue dress, her hair neatly secured beneath a white headscarf. Her voice remained steady as she responded to Ashton's inquiries concerning life on the Thornhill estate. The questions posed by Elijah, the pervasive fear that characterized each day, and the observation of Rebecca's gradual decline until her death. Following this, the defense commenced its cross-examination. Rutherford rose and advanced towards Hannah, wearing an expression of feigned sympathy. "Mrs. Thornhill, you have characterized your husband as controlling and obsessive. Yet, he chose to marry you, bestowed upon you his name, and appointed you as the mistress of his household. What could be his motive if his sole intention was to inflict punishment upon you?" Hannah maintained her gaze unwaveringly. "He married me because he required assistance with his responsibilities," someone he could rely on to coordinate the others to ensure their compliance with his inquiries. He selected me because I was prepared to disclose the information he sought. So you complied willingly? I complied to ensure my survival. And did your husband ever physically assault you? Did he deny you food or treat you cruelly in any physical manner? No. Did he ensure that you and the other women had sufficient shelter, clothing, and food? Yes. Then what exactly was cruel about his treatment? What law did he break? Hannah paused for a moment. Then she carefully replied, he broke no law. That is the true horror of it. Everything he did, every tactic he employed to control us, to shatter Rebecca's spirit, to confine us in that house, all of it was legal. The law safeguards his right to own us, to discipline us, to do whatever he pleases with us, as long as he does not destroy us outright. Even when he does destroy us, as he did with Rebecca, he can argue it was an accident, a result of her own disobedience. Rutherford's expression became stern. So you acknowledge that Rebecca's death was due to her own unwillingness to comply? I acknowledge that she died because my husband ceased to feed her. Whether you attribute that to her fault or his depends on your belief in the right of human beings to resist their owners. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs and Judge Carmichael called for silence. Rutherford posed several more questions, trying to undermine Hannah's credibility or compel her to concede that Elijah had acted within his rights, but she remained resolute. Each response recognized the legality of his actions while highlighting the moral horror beneath. When Hannah concluded her testimony, Calloway felt a glimmer of hope. Her testimony had been impactful, illustrating a narrative of systematic abuse that functioned within the confines of the law. However, would that suffice? The prosecution summoned 3 additional witnesses. Ruth, Leah, and Dina each recounted the pervasive fear that dominated their everyday existence on the estate, detailing how Elijah manipulated food as a means of control and describing Rebecca's gradual deterioration. In response, the defense presented testimony from the auctioneer who had sold the women, neighbors who claimed to have seen no evidence of abuse, and a physician who asserted that fever was a frequent cause of death among enslaved individuals, noting that starvation was challenging to substantiate without a physical examination of the deceased. On the 7th day of the trial, Elijah took the witness stand. He appeared composed, almost serene, as Rutherford guided him through his testimony. He recounted the fire that had claimed his family's lives, the 15 years he had dedicated to uncovering the truth of that night, and his choice to acquire the 7 women due to their ties to the incident. I sought to comprehend, Elijah stated, his tone steady. I needed to ascertain the reasons behind my wife and daughter's deaths. The official inquiry had concluded within weeks. The families involved had concealed their connections, and no one was willing to disclose the truth. Therefore, I located the descendants of those implicated and posed my inquiries. Some, like Hannah, cooperated willingly, while others, such as Rebecca, resisted. I exercised my legal right to discipline those who refused. Did you aim to kill Rebecca? Rutherford inquired. No, my intention was to encourage her cooperation. When she fell ill, I offered whatever medical assistance I could, but she was frail. From refusing to eat properly, the fever took her swiftly. Do you regret her death? Elijah paused for a moment. Then he replied, I regret that she felt compelled to resist so fiercely. I regret that she passed away before I could uncover what her grandmother knew about that night. But I do not regret my pursuit of the truth regarding what happened to my family. The prosecutor, Ashton, rose for cross-examination. Mr. Thornahill, you have characterized your actions as a quest for truth. However, isn't it more precise to assert that you were pursuing revenge? Revenge against whom? The individuals responsible for the fire fled north 17 years ago. I will never witness them being brought to justice. The families who concealed their involvement are shielded by wealth and social standing. What form of revenge could I possibly enact that would hold significance? Revenge against the descendants of those who escaped. Revenge carried out through psychological torment and starvation. I violated no laws, Mr. Ashton. Everything I did was within my rights as a property owner. That does not render it moral. No, Elijah quietly concurred. It does not. However, we are not here to deliberate on morality. We are here to examine legality. Legally, I have committed no wrongdoing. It was a brutally honest response, one that struck at the core of the case's fundamental issue. Elijah had acted within the law, utilizing the legal frameworks of slavery to fulfill a personal obsession that led to at least one death. Yet, if those frameworks safeguarded his actions, how could he be convicted? The trial spanned a total of 11 days. In his closing argument, Ashton depicted Elijah as a man overwhelmed by grief, who had manipulated the law to fulfill his obsession, who had treated human beings as mere instruments in his pursuit of information, and who had established a system of torture that was deemed legal solely due to the inherent injustice of the law itself. Rutherford's closing argument concentrated on property rights, emphasizing the precedent that would be established if a man could be convicted for disciplining his own property, and the perilous implications of permitting the testimony of enslaved individuals to supersede the legal rights of a white man. Judge Carmichael took 2 days to deliberate. On November 15, 1853, he returned to the courtroom to announce his verdict. "This court finds itself in an untenable position," Carmichael began. "We are tasked with ruling on actions that are morally abhorrent, yet legally protected. Mr. Thornhill has confessed to systematically depriving Rebecca of food as a punishment for her disobedience. He has acknowledged that her death was, at least in part, a consequence of the weakness induced by this punishment. Under any reasonable moral framework, these actions amount to abuse and potentially murder. However, this court is not bound by moral principles. We are bound by law, and according to the laws of the state of Alabama and the United States, enslaved individuals are considered property. Property owners possess the right to discipline their property as they deem appropriate within exceedingly broad limits. These limits are seldom enforced and challenging to delineate. The prosecution has, it was contended that Mr. Thornhill's conduct transgressed established boundaries. The assertion that intentional starvation leading to death amounts to the destruction of property, thereby infringing upon interstate commerce regulations, presents a novel legal theory. However, it lacks adequate supporting precedent. Consequently, this court acquits Elijah Thornhill of the allegations against him. The courtroom erupted in reaction. Some attendees expressed their approval, while others voiced their dissent. Judge Carmichael attempted to restore order, yet the disruption had already occurred. Elijah Thornhill exited the courthouse as a liberated individual. Calloway remained outside in the brisk November atmosphere, observing Elijah as he entered a carriage destined for Montgomery. Hannah stood next to the carriage, awaiting his arrival. She cast a fleeting glance back at Calloway, and in that moment, he perceived an unexpected sentiment. It was not despair, but rather an unusual, quiet determination. 3 weeks post-trial, Calloway received a telegram at his mobile office. It was succinct. "Come to Montgomery immediately. Thornhill Estate. Something you need to see. Marshal Gaines." He arrived the following afternoon to discover the estate encircled by local law enforcement. Marshal Gaines greeted him at the entrance, his complexion ashen and strained. "Inspector, I must apologize to you. You were correct about everything. What transpired? Elijah Thornhill is deceased. And what we uncovered in his residence? You must witness it for yourself." The study on the second floor had undergone a transformation. The walls were adorned with numerous documents, hundreds in total, chronicling not only Elijah's 15 years of research, but also something far more elaborate. Maps illustrated the present locations of every individual associated with the families involved in the 1836 escape. Lists provided details about their ages, professions, and familial ties. However, the documents dated after the trial were even more unsettling. Calloway discovered Hannah in the parlor, sitting serenely with her hands folded. "What transpired here, Hannah?" "He returned from the trial transformed," she remarked softly, triumphant yet also adrift. "He had demonstrated that the law shielded him, but it did not grant him what he truly desired. It did not restore his family. It did not alleviate his guilt. How did he meet his end? He ceased to eat. Just as he had done to Rebecca, he inflicted the same fate upon himself. He rejected every meal we prepared. He remained in his study for 11 days, growing frailer until his heart simply ceased to beat. I discovered him 4 days ago." Calloway regarded her intently. "You could have sought assistance, called a physician." "I could have," Hannah conceded, "but he made his decision, and I respected it just as he respected Rebecca's decision in his own tragic manner. There is more, isn't there? Something you have not disclosed to me." Hannah rose and approached a drawer in the side table. She retrieved a substantial envelope and handed it to Calloway. "He requested that I deliver this to you after he was gone. He stated, you were the only person who would comprehend. Inside was a letter in Elijah's handwriting, dated November 18th, 1853. Inspector Calloway, if you are perusing this, I am deceased by my own volition, or rather by my own refusal to nourish myself. The trial confirmed what I have always. I was aware that I operated within the confines of the law, even while I transgressed every moral principle. However, it also demonstrated something else. It demonstrated that the law itself constitutes the crime. For 17 years, I held accountable those who ignited the fire that claimed my family's lives. I dedicated 15 years to tracking their descendants, bringing 7 women to my property for interrogation, compelling them to disclose family secrets. I deluded myself into believing I was pursuing justice, seeking the truth. Yet, the trial illuminated the reality of what I had become. I had exploited the legal protection of slavery to exact personal vengeance. I had transformed human beings into tools of my obsession. I had morphed into the very entity I despised. Someone who shattered families, who stripped away freedom, who wielded power to inflict pain. Rebecca perished because I was too blinded to recognize that her defiance was more honorable than my pursuit. She opted for death rather than betray her grandmother's legacy. That decision possessed more integrity than anything I have accomplished in 17 years. I am concluding my life as a form of atonement, but also as a final declaration. If the law safeguards individuals like me, if it permits us to perpetrate atrocities under the pretense of property rights, then the law must undergo reform. Let my demise serve as evidence of how profoundly slavery corrupts both the enslaved and the enslaver. Hannah and the other women are liberated in my will. The property is bequeathed to them collectively. It is insufficient recompense for my actions. Yet, it is all I can provide. Inform the world of what transpired here, Inspector. Not merely that a man starved his slave and was acquitted, but that the law led him to believe he had the right to act in such a manner. Inform them that slavery devastates all it affects and that legal entitlements founded on human anguish will ultimately undermine the society that upholds them. Elijah Thornhill Calloway meticulously folded the letter. Were you aware of his plans? I had my suspicions, Hannah remarked. After the trial, he appeared defeated despite his success. He had demonstrated his ability to function within the legal framework, yet it brought him no solace. I believe he finally grasped that what he had been pursuing all these years was not truth or justice, but redemption. And that was something the law could never provide. What are your next steps? Hannah surveyed the parlor of the house that had served as a prison for almost 2 years. We will sell the property. The 7 of us will split the proceeds and go our own ways. Some will travel north, while others will remain in Alabama. I have yet to make a decision. But we will be free, truly free for the first time in our lives. Legally, the trial changed nothing. Calloway stated, men will persist in abusing their power. The law will continue to shield them. The trial altered everything. Hannah gently corrected him, saying, it compelled people to recognize what slavery truly is. Not a benevolent institution, nor property rights, but legalized torture. Elijah's death, his confession, all of it now becomes part of the record. It is part of the evidence that will eventually dismantle this system. She was correct. Calloway understood that the trial transcripts, Elijah's journals, the letters from Rebecca and Hannah, everything would endure. Future generations would learn about the Thornhill case and clearly understand what the law had safeguarded and what it had obliterated. The narrative spread throughout Alabama and beyond. Newspapers in the North published excerpts from the trial transcripts and Elijah's final letter. Abolitionist speakers referenced the case as proof of slavery's moral decay. Southern proponents of slavery dismissed it as an isolated event, yet the details were too unsettling to overlook completely. Hannah and the 6 other women sold the Thornhill estate in January 1854. They shared the proceeds equally and went their separate ways, with most heading north to free states. Hannah herself settled in Philadelphia, where she lived quietly until her death in 1889. She never publicly discussed her time on the Thornhill estate, but she retained copies of all the documents, all the letters, everything that attested to what had transpired there. Inspector Thomas Calloway continued his efforts to investigate illegal slave trading operations until the Civil War commenced in 1861. He enlisted in the Union Army and survived the war, later working for the Freedmen's Bureau, assisting formerly enslaved individuals in navigating their newfound freedom. He passed away in 1891, and among his papers was a complete file on the Thornhill case, meticulously preserved. The Thornhill estate remained vacant for 3 years after the sale, then was consumed by a fire of unknown origin in 1857. Some locals claim to have seen lights moving through the deserted building in the weeks leading up to the fire were filled with speculation. Some claimed it was a manifestation of divine retribution upon a cursed location. The property was never reconstructed. Presently, a state historical marker is positioned near the site of the former house, honoring the Thornhill incident of 1853 as a significant event in the legal and ethical discussions surrounding slavery that ultimately divided the nation. However, the true legacy of the events that transpired there resides in the documents, in the accounts of the women who endured, and in the unsettling inquiries it provokes regarding legal frameworks built upon human anguish. Elijah Thornhill acted within the confines of the law. This was both the horror and the lesson that could not be overlooked. What are your thoughts on this narrative? Could such an occurrence have genuinely taken place in America's history? The legal documentation is available. The testimonies have been recorded, yet the ethical dilemmas persist unresolved even today. Please share your reflections in the comments section below. If this narrative prompted contemplation, discomfort, or a questioning of the vast divide between legal and moral principles, then consider sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing it. Subscribe to this channel for more overlooked histories that merit remembrance. Activate the notification bell and accompany us in delving into the most shadowy aspects of America's past. For it is only through comprehending what transpired that we can guarantee it never recurs.